Hi, my name is Aoife and I'm a trainee clinical psychologist based here in the Southeastern Trust. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about bereavement and grief during COVID-19. Now, I know this is not the funnest of topics, and there's often a bit of a taboo around talking about death and bereavement. I suppose that's natural because it's scary and it's an uncomfortable thing to think about, and it can often remind us of our losses that we've experienced before. But unfortunately, it's also something that more and more of us have had to deal with this year, and something which we will all have to face in the future. So it might be worth just taking a few minutes out of your day to explore a few thoughts around this area with me, and then you can get back to all your fun activities today and whatever you were doing before you clicked onto this video. And then you can just store away this information in the back of your mind for whenever you might need it. And if you're watching this today because you are recently bereaved, I just want to say I'm really sorry for your loss, and I hope that some of what we'll be talking about today might be helpful. Okay, so as I'm sure you know, there's a mountain of papers being released daily with guidance and knowledge during COVID-19. And these all contain really useful information, but sometimes it can be really difficult to know where to start and what to do. So a really important topic that's being discussed lately is that of bereavement in such an unprecedented time and how we can manage that. So guidance has been released by the HSE Public Health Agency and also by the British Psychological Society regarding this topic. And there's some really useful information in there. So I thought today I could go through it. So it'll probably be a whistle-stop tour, but I just wanted to give an overview of some of the key points of what might be helpful to know, and then leave you with some pointers of where you might find some further information if you would like to find out some more. So today I'll be covering an overview of what grief is, what it looks like, and how to support yourself and others when grieving. So I figured this is probably a good enough place to start. What is it? What are we talking about? So bereavement is what happens to us, grief is what we feel, and mourning is what we do. So sometimes it's hard to get our head around all the different terminology that's used, but this is what I'll hopefully be sticking to today. So try and keep that in mind as we're going through. So what is grief? One way of thinking of it, it's a normal response to a loss, this abnormal event in our life. And grief serves a really important purpose to help us heal and to readjust to life following the loss of a loved one. And it often goes on for quite a while following the death or the loss. It's not something that can be measured in days or weeks or months. It's more of a process of healing. With grief, it's not just about getting over it or moving on. It takes time. It's learning to live with that loss. And it's not something that happens in stages. It's not a linear process. It's more of an observation. It's an ebb and flow. It's moving from one set of emotions and thoughts and behaviors to another. One way of thinking of it is grief is love with nowhere to go. And unfortunately, grief doesn't care that there's a pandemic. The feelings are going to come anyway. It doesn't care that the support systems we normally rely on aren't available in the same way. And this is what's been making it extremely difficult for the last number of months. Particularly in our culture in Northern Ireland, people often find great comfort and support in the connection that's provided through the rituals in those early days of bereavement. But being in the midst of a global pandemic complicates this and complicates that normal mourning and grieving process. So we're not able to gather to offer condolences. We're not able to attend funerals or wakes or connect with a community in the same way we might have done previously. And similarly, with more and more people being asked to self-isolate or to social distance from their friends and family, this can be a particular challenge for grieving during a pandemic. And often grief is portrayed as just being this one single feeling, this one thing we feel. But in fact, it's a range of emotions and reactions which affect how we think and we behave. And it's also really important to remember that grief looks different on everyone. It's a really unique and personal process. And you may be surprised at the ways it can affect you, particularly during the current crisis. You might notice that others may not look like you do when you're grieving, or others may not sound like you do when you're grieving. But that's because we all grieve differently. So allow for those differences. We all live differently, we all love differently, and we all grieve differently. So When thinking of grief, it can be useful to separate it out into the impact it can have on our emotions, on our body, on how we behave, and also on our thoughts and our cognitive processes. So if we start with our emotions, and this is probably the one that comes to mind first for a lot of people when thinking about grief. So, you have shock, anger, guilt, worry, fear, and despair and intense sadness. So the idea of the shock, feeling numb, maybe finding it's difficult to accept or believe what's happened. And this may be even more challenging during the current pandemic, when you may not have had the opportunity to see your loved one at the time of their death or even afterwards. A lot of people would report grief for maybe things that they had said or maybe hadn't said, or maybe feeling guilty that they were still alive while others were suffering. Sometimes, people can experience a lot of worry or fear for what lies ahead, and particularly at the moment, feeling worried for your own or your family's health due to COVID infections. And this is to be expected. Loneliness is also something that's often reported when people are grieving, and this can even happen when surrounded by others. But particularly when we think now, if you're in isolation or you have more limited contact from family or friends due to restrictions being in place, that loneliness might be something that comes up a bit more often. So it's important to keep that in mind. And then we look at our body. And this is often overlooked, but that physical impact of grief that so many people who are grieving would report. So, those changes in appetite, changes in sleep routine. So people having poor quality of sleep, feeling that they can't get to sleep, or maybe feeling that they're having a lot of nightmares when they do get to sleep. Other people might report lots of aches and pains or just feeling exhausted. Some people can also experience those general symptoms of anxiety. So feeling that your heart is racing, you've sweaty palms, or you've got knots in your tummy. So these are all really common experiences when grieving. Something which I feel is not often talked about is, sometimes people can see, hear, or even feel the presence of their loved one after they've passed. And I think it's important to touch on this and to note that it is common to have those experiences during grief, and it can be a normal part of the grieving process. But if you're not expecting this to happen and don't know that it can happen, I imagine it would be a really scary time, and it would just add on to the impact of what you're already experiencing. And then, it's important to also consider how grief and bereavement can influence our behaviours. So there's lots here on the screen, from crying, overeating, undereating, and overworking, which can lead to burnout then. And some are more common than others. But once again, it's because everyone is different and everyone has different coping strategies for different situations. So some people might experience all of these and some people might experience one of these. Everyone is different. One particularly common one we would see quite a lot is isolation and withdrawing from life. So maybe avoiding family and friends or places and activities. And sometimes this is because they can bring up too much sadness. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes maybe they bring up happiness and joy that the person feels that they don't deserve to feel following the loss. And sometimes people can jump to those quick fixes to try and numb the pain. So maybe relying on alcohol or drugs. But what often happens is, while these can mask the problem in the short term, in the long term, they often end up causing additional distress. And that's why we would always encourage people to try and rely on alternative strategies, which we'll be touching on later. Another important thing, which I think is important to touch on at the moment, particularly during COVID, is our response to the media. Sometimes it can feel so hard to escape from the coverage of COVID on the news. You turn on the TV, it's there. You open a paper, it's there. Turn on social media, it's there too. And especially if you've, after experiencing a loss due to COVID, or a loss that you're experiencing is being complicated by COVID, it can trigger your own feelings of sadness and you can feel overwhelmed by the situation. So you might experience a strong desire to take a step back from the constant media coverage of COVID. This is normal and it can be really helpful for everyone. Taking a break from media coverage or just limiting the amount that you're consuming. This can be good self-care and self-management going forward. And then we look at, how grief can impact and affect our thought processes and our cognitive functioning. So common thoughts that people who are grieving might say would be, why did this have to happen? It's not fair. How will I cope? And just you can see that pattern of trying to make sense of what is going on in their life. We would also commonly hear people finding it difficult making decisions or difficulties with concentration and forgetfulness. These are all common processes with grief. Sometimes people might get into patterns of avoiding or trying to block out certain thoughts, or maybe the opposite, trying to, become preoccupied with thoughts or replaying different situations in the past over and over again in your head. And I suppose these are all understandable when we consider the emotional, the physical, and the behavioural aspects of grief that we've just discussed. So our bodies are in crisis mode. Our mind is focused on A, the loss, and B, how we're getting through from moment to moment. So what do we do? How can you support yourself following a bereavement, particularly during COVID? So once again, I think it's important to repeat here that grief looks different on everyone. There is no uniform to wear and everyone will have different needs. So allow yourself to feel it in whatever way feels the most natural for you. As in normal times, it's important to prepare for that initial autopilot mode to wear off. So, the first few days following loss are typically dominated by those rituals. So preparing for a funeral and all those practical things that have to be done, getting everything organized, maybe having a wake or whatever ritualistic ceremonies are facilitated in your culture or religion. And what happens is after this, people may begin to notice that they actually start feeling worse rather than better. And this is normal. It's likely the full impact of that bereavement is only beginning to register. And particularly now with COVID, the absence of some of those rituals will have an impact. So people don't have a chance to attend funerals. They don't have the chance to hug or get support from their families. So the chances are that autopilot stage will wear off a lot quicker than before. And it's likely the emotional impact might come on a bit quicker and a lot more intense. And again, societal change and restrictions will impact on our normal support networks. But it's still really important to try and keep connected to our family, our friends, and our communities as much as possible to try and prevent isolation. And online interaction is key to this recently. So using platforms like Google Hangouts, FaceTime, WhatsApp, or Zoom. And I know learning new skills and using all this new technology can feel like an additional burden on top of everything you're already dealing with and feeling exhausted and overwhelmed. But it can be really useful, especially to connect with special people in your life who maybe you can't physically be with during this time. The next important thing is minding your body so that your body can mind you. So getting those basics right, making sure you're eating right, you're sleeping right, you're keeping connected with others, and you're trying to get out for some fresh air and exercise. And it can be really helpful to try and stick to your normal routines as much as possible too. So getting up in the mornings, having regular meal times, and trying to go to bed again in the evening at roughly the same time. And giving yourself that time to grieve. It's going to take as long as it takes. So giving yourself permission to feel whatever you feel and to share your feelings. So make use of the support from people around you, as you might find that it helps to talk through how you're feeling. So it's important to look for, but also to accept support from others around you, both emotional and practical. If someone offers to drop over food in a socially distant manner that is fitting in with restrictions, don't be afraid to say yes. This is the time we need to rely on our support systems, particularly with COVID and the restrictions that it's placing on our lives. And supporting others. Sometimes you'll often hear people saying, it's hard to know what the best thing to do is to support someone who's recently bereaved. And I think the key thing to remember here is there's no perfect thing that you can say or do, but the best thing you can do is just to be genuine, caring, and compassionate. Particularly during COVID, people are going to need more support and likely in different ways than before. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the death in whatever way you can, even though it may not be possible to do this in the normal ways of a funeral. So sending cards, writing letters, maybe telling a story of the person or a memory you have of them that you think the bereaved person might like to hear. And sometimes there can be a concern of bothering people, but more often than not, it's the lack of acknowledgement that can hurt. And people who are grieving often like to talk about the loss and to talk about the life of the person that they've lost. So offer a listening ear and just be there for them, for whatever they need. Maybe they'll want to talk, and that's great. In that case, just listen and be there with them. And maybe they won't want to talk, and that's okay. In that case, just offer to sit with them in silence. And again, offer that practical support as well as the emotional support. So while observing social distance and current restrictions, it may still be possible to offer to pick up shopping or deliver meals, anything that you think would help. So ask what you can do. Don't just assume. Just say, I want to be here for you. What can I do? And also be aware of cultural or religious beliefs which the person may have and how they may differ from your own, and try and respect these differences. It's also important to remember that children are affected by this too. They grieve just as much, if not more, than adults, but it might look a little differently than how an adult may grieve. So check in with them often and answer their questions honestly. There's a lot of really great information out there about how to support children who are grieving, and there's some on the Public Health Agency website, so I'll try and link some of that below for you to have a look at if that's relevant. So this is also something that's been coming up again and again, and that's supporting yourself following the death of a patient during COVID-19. You know, for some healthcare professionals, they may be used to being with patients and working with patients at the end of their lives, but somehow this feels like it's on a completely different scale and level. For others, maybe they've been redeployed, or maybe they're just experiencing it more than usual or in a different way. And this can be a really difficult experience, particularly if those usual work rituals that you might be used to carrying out are no longer possible. So having that contact with the family and loved ones, or being able to support them more during this time, this can bring a profound sense of loss. And sometimes we're hearing even a sense of guilt or shame that you're not able to mark someone's death in the way that you normally would. And I can understand that this would add a huge amount of pressure and just feel really heavy to hold. So it might be about finding new ways to mark and acknowledge the loss, which is more suited to the current work environment that you're finding yourselves in. And one idea, maybe it's about taking a moment before you leave the room, just closing your eyes for a second and taking a deep breath. On the inhale, imagining the life that that person once had. And as you exhale, let it represent an acknowledgement of their life, their loss, and your connection with them. And, you know, related to this, more and more we're hearing about healthcare workers experiencing compassion fatigue and burnout. So feeling absolutely exhausted mentally and physically. And this is going to take its toll on you and your ability to grieve and manage these really difficult situations. So it reminds us again of the importance of self-care at all times, but particularly at the moment during the pandemic when you're being faced with these really difficult situations. So looking after your body and looking after your mind, using some of the information we've discussed and more. The South Eastern Trust have produced some really great resources and webinars recently that have touched on this and gone into a lot more detail on how you can support yourself during this difficult time. So again, I will link those below and you can check them out hopefully after this talk. And also it's important to look at how do we support bereaved staff following the death of a colleague. And particularly during the pandemic, I think this is really important because it's going to have a significant impact on work and the work environment. And again, it's important to remember that everyone's grief will be different. And this will be influenced by their relationship with the deceased person, their previous life experiences, their personalities, their beliefs, and there's a list of things. So it's not something that's possible to quantify. Grief affects the whole community and the whole system. So allow for changes. You know, accept that things will be different and it might take a little while for things to settle and to feel like a new normal has been established. So take advantage of all the support available, and often this can come from the people around you. So don't be afraid to speak to your colleagues. Remember, they're likely experiencing similar emotions as you. And often this mutual support, even if it's done virtually, can bring a sense of connection and camaraderie, which is really needed at the moment. You can consider a memorial to mark the loss, maybe putting up a photo or lighting a candle, or even sending a sympathy card to the family. And then other memorial activities can be planned for the future when the current crisis ends. You can always contact the Trust Bereavement Support Coordinator for further support in this area. I think, it's important at this point to recognise the importance of being compassionate towards yourself and to those around you, especially in this situation. Managing loss is hard, and every individual should feel supported in experiencing that journey in their own way and in their own time. And before I finish up, I just want to have a quick note. I know this is a really difficult subject matter to think about today or to be listening to this talk on today. And I'm very aware that there's likely individuals here watching this who have been affected by bereavement during COVID-19 in some way, or even who knows someone who has been. So remember, if you need support, there's no shame in asking for help. And I thought this would be a good time to highlight some of the supports being offered by the Trust. So again, as I just mentioned there, the Bereavement Support Coordinator for this Trust is Paul McCluskey, who can be a great resource and providing support and training to staff and to teams regarding end-of-life and bereavement care. And he can also help in signposting different supports and resources. Also, the Staff Psychological Support COVID helpline, which offers free, confidential psychological support to staff affected by COVID. So it's available Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I'd really encourage you to avail of that if you feel that you need some extra support. Similarly, Inspire Workplaces offers a confidential one-to-one psychological support to staff. So I will provide the link to some resources that I mentioned during this and also the resources that I used to inform this presentation, and I'll put them in the description box below if you want to check out anything further or get some more information. So thank you for listening and taking time out of your day to join me in exploring this idea of bereavement and grief, and I hope it's been informative.